personalized support for every student. Notable accomplishments include improved district-wide academic outcomes on the state MCAS assessment, especially for students of color and low-income students. A strong believer in community partnerships, Dr. Salim co-chairs the Cambridge STEAM Advisory Committee with Cambridge's city manager and is a member of the Cambridge Family Policy Council. Prior to coming to the Cambridge Public Schools, Dr. Salim was the superintendent of the Weymouth Public Schools, a 7,000 student school district south of Boston. Before that, he was a senior district administrator in the Boston Public Schools. He began his teaching career as a biology teacher at Brighton High School in Boston, where he developed the Advanced Placement Biology program. The first in his family to graduate from college, Dr. Salim earned his bachelor's degree in biology at Brown University and his doctorate in the Urban Superintendent's program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. We will be recording this program, and I heartily welcome you, Dr. Salim, to the Cambridge Club tonight. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Kathy, and thanks for the invitation. Great to be here, and I'm excited to be able to share an overview of our work here in Cambridge Public Schools, and also to be able to talk about a few different areas. I'm going to share my screen because there are going to be a few number of slides I'm going to talk through as I go through my talk. Folks see that okay?
Yes.
All right, great. So so my sort of the roadmap for this evening that hope to go through is to talk about the CPS district plan that Kathy alluded to. There are a 3-year multi-year plan. Our outcome measures that we have been utilizing to measure progress against that plan over the last several years. And then shift to talking about sort of what our back to school reopening during the pandemic and the time of COVID-19 has been. I'll touch upon a specific area, which is our Rin School of Technical Arts, the Career Tech Ed program, before opening up for questions and discussion. But before starting off into Cambridge, I thought I'd just take a couple of minutes to share a little bit more about my own background before talking specifically about my work in Cambridge. And starting off, wanted to tell a story about my family name, because as some people sometimes notice, is Salim is not a name that usually is somebody of East Asian descent is a name that's usually held, but is a name that was a result of my parents' upbringing in Indonesia. My parents grew up in Bandung, Indonesia, in West Java, and they were part of the ethnic Chinese minority. And it was in the 60s when there was a real terrible period of violence that erupted across Indonesia as part of a Red Scare where hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Some of you might be familiar with the documentary from a number of years back now called The Act of Killing, maybe about a few years ago, that chronicled the period actually through interviews with people who were the aggressors during that time. Both a really disturbing and also insightful documentary. But it was during this anti-communist and anti-Chinese sentiment in the country that the use of Chinese characters was banned from storefront signs, and where my family, along with many others of Chinese descent, actually changed their names to more Indonesian sounding names. And Indonesia being a country that's predominantly Muslim, that meant changing it to an Arabic name, Salim, which is a name of Arabic origin that means peace. My parents actually left Indonesia in the 70s and came to the States. And while some of my parents' friends decided to change their names back to their original Chinese names, my father decided to keep the name Salim as our family name, as a way of remembering these experiences and this story. they settled. My dad actually, when he first moved to the country, actually was sponsored by a family that lived in Boring, Oregon, which hard to make up, but a town actually outside of Portland. But then eventually moved into New York City. This is where we lived on Second Avenue. In a apartment buildings called the Phipps Plaza West buildings, which were a state publicly subsidized apartments, where I lived with my three younger siblings and my mom and my dad, and my mother had me when she was 19, and you know, grew up in the city, and where after growing up, did go to Providence for college, and really the vast majority of my professional life has been in the Boston area, with a stint where I was in worked for the San Francisco Unified School District for the superintendent out there. But I did, as Kathy mentioned, I taught at Brighton High School. This is a photograph of Brighton High, which is part of Boston Public Schools. Taught biology to 5 sections of 10th graders, had 160 students, and had wonderful colleagues and students at the time. And what I'm most proud of is that several of my former students are now classroom teachers in Boston and in Massachusetts. And those experiences as a teacher really greatly inform a great deal of how I think about support for teachers, and have shaped who I am as an educational leader. I care deeply around professional learning, professional development, and believe that we need to provide learning opportunities for adults if we're going to achieve the results that we want for all students. And through that, and related to that, I've had a chance to work as the president of the Board of Trustees for an organization called Learning Forward, which is the professional association for professional development in K-12 education, and had a chance to also be part of a convening sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on redesigning professional development, that brought together thought leaders around the country. As you heard, I came to Cambridge from Weymouth, 7,000 student district, which was growing in its diversity. Actually, the 2 most spoken languages after English are Portuguese and Arabic. So interesting diversity of families and students there. And I actually came into Weymouth from Boston Public Schools as the first superintendent to be hired outside the district since the 60s, and so was a real opportunity to learn and partner and work with a different community. Which brings me to my time here in Cambridge, and in my work, I was telling the small group, I certainly bring all those experiences working in many different school districts, but in addition, also as the parent of 2 young children. I have a 6-year-old and a 21-month-old. Also think a lot about this work from the perspective of the parents. See remote learning from this side of the screen as well, as I think about the work that we're trying to do for our students across Cambridge. We have an enrollment that has been increasing over the last number of years. It's been approximately about a 2% increase year over year, going back from the 15-16 school year. You see that we're shy of 7,500 students. And interestingly, a lot of that growth has been actually at the we've actually seen growth at different levels, but at the high school, actually the 9th grade class has been growing to about 500 students now, and just has begun to level off there. And also is a community that represents a real diversity of students, both in terms of the economic diversity as well as racial and ethnic diversity. You see some of the 1920 numbers here. Nearly 50% are categorized as high needs, which is a category that includes language status as well as whether economically disadvantaged and students with disabilities. And about 40% are eligible for free or reduced lunch. But I will say that that number in the aggregate does mask what we're seeing as a shift. As folks on this call well know, the demographics of Cambridge, particularly for our our youngest learners are skewing more privileged socioeconomically. And so we're not only seeing that the numbers of, or the percentage of those eligible for free reduced lunch are lower at those age bands, but also among those that are the paid lunch families, as we refer to for our controlled choice system, are much wealthier than previous cohorts of families in Cambridge. And so it's a dynamic that continues to be part of I think what we see in Cambridge, and as the community, of course, is trying to look at things like affordable housing as one of those central issues for the community. The district plan that we have set out has this vision around rigorous, joyful, culturally responsive learning. And these 5 objectives that are outlined in this circle here, equity and access, engaging learning, the whole child as an individual, family and community partnerships, and implementation and progress monitoring. And we see those as sort of the big rocks or the big bets that we have organized our resource allocation, our school improvement plans, and our efforts across the district. In addition, in the last couple of years, have really deepened the work around equity and racial equity. And as a community have done work with our leadership teams, our principals, our school committee as well around equity and racial equity, and have actually developed these definitions that have been codified or adopted by the school committee as excuse me, as our definitions of what it means to have equity or have racial equity in our system, and a real focus on how we're dismantling structures rooted in white privilege and centering underrepresented voices and recognizing and eliminating bias. We have engaged in effort that was funded by the Nellie Mae Education Foundation in partnership with the Cambridge Teachers Union, the Education Association, where we actually engaged in a project called the Building Equity Bridges Project that looked at uncovering the root causes of inequity. And so we, through that work, identified a number of barriers that families and community members and students articulated as barriers to achieving equity in Cambridge. And so you see here some of those ways in which we would work differently to disrupt those barriers related to consistency across schools, the centering of relationships as a primary focus, addressing issues of privilege and white supremacy at all levels in the system, looking at how decision-making is carried out, looking at our structures and systems, and structures and accountability measures for anti-racist work in the system. Part of that work has led to a number of different initiatives related to our equity focus. The district plan focusing on a set of measures that look at how we can close opportunity and outcome gaps that I'll speak to in a moment. This definition around racial equity and work that we've done with district leaders in the school committee. Some of you may have seen there were also citywide conversations that were co-led by then Mayor Mark McGovern and now Mayor Sumbul Siddiqui with an organization called DEEP, Disrupting Educational Equity Project, which is led by Dr. Darnisa Monte. We engaged in that work as a system. We had that work with the Building Equity Bridges Project. Hiring and retaining educators of color has been a long time priority and one that we've made important progress in. Part of that has also looked at how we can broaden the pipeline to have more educators, more aspiring educators of color, including a paraprofessional to teacher pipeline in partnership with Lesley University. We've worked on trainings at the school and district level around racial equity work and our school improvement plans at the school level. focused work using a text by Zaretta Hammond called Culture Responsive Teaching in the Brain, looking at specific strategies for engaging learners in culture responsive ways, using ideas like how to be a warm demander, having high expectations, but also providing support for students to attain those high standards and engage in productive struggle. We have engaged in a multi-year effort around detracking classes for students in the 9th and 10th grade in English Language Arts and Social Studies called Level Up, as well as an effort at the upper schools, which are our middle grade schools, called Enhanced Math at the upper schools. And we've also launched a set of school climate surveys that I also touch upon through the work as part of the district plan. When we set out with this district plan, we worked with the school committee to identify 7 outcome measures that we would use to measure our progress. And we're deliberate around having a combination of academic measures as well as other measures that looked at progress in the district. And I'll touch upon these. I'll go through these different measures and where we are. Grade 3 MCAS, so English Language Arts, is a common measure that's utilized across the country, and it's an area where we've seen improvement over the last number of years with an increase of 14 points since 2017, and we've consistently outperformed the state average in every demographic group on this measure as well. Another measure we've utilized is Grade A Math, a measure that looks at not just the performance of students here, but also growth, looking at how much students have improved as compared with similar students across the state. And that growth measure is something that is an important one that we look at as well. And so you see here also where we've been able to outperform the state averages or be at that same state average across all different demographic groups. And whereas in the most recent MCAS results, the state saw a little bit of a dip, we still saw some improved achievement here at this level. We also, at the outcome measure looking at the high school, I've looked at AP and honors access and performance. And I know there's a lot of data on this slide, but what we're essentially looking at here is the enrollment of students in AP and honors classes, and looking also using our lens around racial equity, looking specifically at African American Black students and Latino students who have been underrepresented in AP and honors classes, and looking at how we can increase not just enrollment, but also number of students taking the AP exam and ultimately the performance as well. And so it's both looking at the access piece as well as the performance piece. And so you see the increases there, as well as a slight decrease in terms of the percentage of students that were achieving a 3 or higher on APs. The fourth one is this measure around the percentage of teachers of color. I'm proud to say that at the administrative level, well over 50% of the senior leadership team identify as people of color, as well as our principal ranks as well. We're over 50%. And we're looking at teachers, which is, we are second only to Boston statewide in terms of the percentage of teachers of color. And we did reach 25% in the last school year, which was a long-standing goal of the school committee in Cambridge. And it's been really by really focusing on this and looking at ways that we can also support hiring committees, have language in our job descriptions that's more inclusive, as well as looking at pipeline programs like the Project Elevate, where we're looking at how we can also have a robust pipeline for aspiring people of color to become teachers in CPS. The fifth outcome is around school climate, and this is an outcome where we utilize a survey in partnership with an organization called Panorama Education, where we have family surveys, student surveys, and staff surveys. And so the idea is we're sort of using these three different stakeholders as part of how we're looking at the overall ratings around school climate. But we're also looking at how we can also increase family survey participation rate. And so you can see some of the changes there in terms of increasing the response rate for family surveys. The sixth outcome is a very specific one related to a survey that we do for our middle grade and high school age students, the teen and middle grades school health surveys. And this was a specific question around whether or not students felt like they had an adult they can go to if they had a problem. And so you can see some of the data here. And you can see that, something that has been part of our focus is looking at, again, some of the disproportionality. Here we see that a lower percentage of African American Black students reporting that as compared with their white peers across the high school and middle grades. And so again, sort of thinking back to that that slide that outlines some of the barriers, how thinking about the importance of relationships, and of course now in this unusual mode of instruction we're in, how even more critically important that is. And then the seventh, chronic absenteeism. This is a measure that also has been one that has been a challenge for Cambridge. It's actually one where we are performing not as well as the state average in terms of chronic absenteeism, and one that has been a focus. And we had an interesting conversation in the smaller group before about sort of, how we also think about attendance and participation, particularly in a remote learning environment. So this is, while taking on a different meaning in this remote learning context for many of our students, still continues to be an important focus. And it's one that is also part of the overall accountability system, at the state level as well when they're assessing districts and schools. So those are the 7 outcome measures that we utilize as part of a district plan in terms of measuring progress and performance. What I want to shift to now is talking just a few points just around a reopening plan for this school year, for this unusual 2020-21 school year. Related to this idea around relationships are some of these objectives that we set out with the overall goal that the safety and well-being of our students, families, and staff has been what we have held center in our planning for reopening this school year. Nurturing relationships, providing differentiated learning experiences, partnering with families, and really using that equity lens to focus support on students with the greatest needs has been what we've hoped to accomplish as part of our reopening plan. We have these guiding principles that we utilized as we developed plans, which were iterated on over the course of July and August, as we sought to incorporate feedback from folks on how we should structure the reopening for in-person learning for our students. And you see some of those similar themes across our guiding principles here, from the focus on health and safety to racial equity to relationships and family partnership, focusing on support for staff as well, who are engaged in what I shared earlier, as what for many staff feels like being a first-year teacher all over again, because so much is different around teaching remotely and how demanding it is. And I hear that from colleagues across the state and the country, that from friends of mine who are teachers to teachers here in Cambridge, that they're working harder than they ever have, or that they can remember, because that preparation and time for remote learning is that much more intense during this time. And so what we did in reopening, and we're just on our 4th day today, we reopened schools to in-person learning last Tuesday, October 13th. And what we did was we sort of said that, remote learning is the default. And so we did a remote learning starting on September 16th for all students. And then October 13th, we made in-person learning available to students that we thought were who struggled the most last spring with remote learning. So that included our students with disabilities who were in substantially separate special education programs, our English language learners who were in programs called sheltered English immersion programs. So any of those students, K to 12, could opt for in-person learning. In addition, at our elementary schools, any family who had a preschooler, junior kindergartner, or first grade would be guaranteed a seat if they chose in-person learning. And then for grades 2 and 3, we prioritized seats. So we had a cap on the available seats, but we prioritized seats for students with disabilities, students experiencing homelessness, English learners, and former English learners, and then continue to fill the seats until they were filled based on other needs based defined at the students that schools felt would benefit the most. This was a different model than what most other communities did. Most districts in the Commonwealth have sort of a combination hybrid that's either week on and week off, or 2 days in, 3 days out. We instead did something that was 4 days a week, which is a much more intensive staffing model. And so we've invested a lot in new staff. We've hired about 30 new teachers, nearly 60 paraprofessional instructional aides to support this model of in-person learning. Another important part of reopening schools was making sure that our learning environments were as safe as possible. And so we use the 6-foot distancing. So by having students spaced 6 feet apart, that's partly what drives staffing need, because their class sizes are smaller. So class sizes are somewhere between 10 and 14 students in our buildings right now. We increased the number of sinks, put sinks in common areas, set up what we're calling these get well rooms, and also invested a lot in air quality mitigation in terms, including these HEPA air scrubbers, window box fans, as well as making sure every classroom had at least one operable window. We also had to make changes to the bus transportation. We've invested, spent a lot of resources on personal protective equipment, have over 200,000 masks, face shields, and over 1 million gloves, and also redeployed custodial staff to be able to increase the daily cleaning and sanitizing at the schools where we have in-person learning, as well as other equipment like electrostatic sprayers, as well as a lot of hand sanitizer and the like across all of our schools. Testing, we're doing something that I think is pretty unique, probably, I have to say, like in the country, by having twice a week testing available to all staff that are working in person in Cambridge. We've done this in partnership with the Cambridge Public Health Department. These rapid tests are being conducted by the Broad Institute. And so the results are, within 24 hours. And so that's being provided to all staff who are working in person, as well as any student that might develop symptoms, that those tests would also be available. The school committee, when they approved this plan, also adopted a set of contingencies that included testing, looking at our metrics, having the safety and facilities manual, having a collaborative process around planning for our program for students with disabilities, as well as looking at possible ways of supporting childcare in partnership with the city, and looking at social, emotional, and mental behavioral health plans for our students as well as our staff. We've tried to communicate a lot of this information, been kind of on a public information campaign on getting this information out to families. We have this reopening data dashboard that actually is what we utilize to as the threshold for our in-person learning model. This gets updated daily as new data becomes available, but we're using these metrics. Again, sort of unique in the Commonwealth. We're looking at daily new cases, not just in Cambridge, but actually in Middlesex County and Suffolk County, recognizing that the risk in Cambridge itself is actually the rate is very low in Cambridge, but many of our staff and educators are coming from surrounding communities. So worked with our scientific advisors to develop this metric of looking at the region, as well as the overall state positivity rate and wastewater monitoring. So we actually get data from Deer Island, the wastewater treatment plant, on because while not everybody gets tested, everyone, of course, goes to the bathroom. And so actually looking at the viral copies of RNA of the virus in wastewater is a measure that we're also looking at, which I know a number of our higher ed institutions in the region are also doing as well. This is the breakdown of just the in-person learning, just to give a picture of how many of the total enrollment of students at these pre-K to grade 3 are, how many have elected for in-person, and the percentage of the numbers of students that would have been eligible to come in. So you see that breakdown racially as well as socioeconomic status using the free reduced lunch measure as well. I'm going to try to go through to the next slides quickly, because I know I want to leave enough time for questions. I just wanted to bookmark this slide. Is just we've tried to create also family-facing resources on using masks, on what to do in different situations to try to keep it as family-friendly as possible. And as we've kind of looked at different key issues and considerations, so thinking about the planning I mentioned before around the need for planning time for educators, the social emotional needs, not just of students, but also staff. We're sort of at this interesting point where we are both, it feels a little kind of this sort of living in both worlds of thinking about what it might look like to expand in-person learning for more students, while at the same time recognizing, as we're seeing what's happening in surrounding communities and across the state, that we may very well have to reduce the number of in-person students. And so that, this sort of this importance of planning for multiple scenarios is a big part of what we're going to be doing as well. So I'm going to pause here and just so that there is some time for questions and discussion. And Kathy, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Salim. Shippen, you had a question. Do you want to ask the first? Do you want to launch question and answer?
Thank you, Kathy. Sure. Dr. Salim, thank you so much for joining us. I am head of the Cambridge Public Library Foundation, and I'm most interested to know how the library is able to help the school system with its mission, and where you think you might welcome more resources or more ideas. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the things that we've had just very preliminary conversations about is just thinking about how important it is to just have students access to read alouds, just like videos of read alouds for different levels of books and different interests and different things. And teachers have been doing a lot of work of trying to record those, and librarians, library media specialists across our schools. But I could see that I haven't had a chance to talk to Maria specifically, Maria McCauley, about this. But that could be an area where we could strengthen that. I know that for giving also, we've actually done an effort in the last couple of years of giving all of our kindergartners library cards. And so we've developed and really have it be an opt-out, so that the default is everybody gets a library card. And I know that many of those books you can take out online, through apps like Libby, or even through the devices like Kindle. So looking for those opportunities is something that we're want to definitely explore more.
Thank you.
Minka, you had a question about absenteeism.
Well, it was more noticing how high the chronic absenteeism is in the students who have an IEP, and I wondered how that compared with other school districts.
Yeah, so definitely it is an area that is of I don't know the overall state average related to this. As I mentioned, it is an area that overall I think that we need to be very mindful of, and particularly with our students with disabilities who having those opportunities for needing to be in school in order to learn is something that as we're looking even in this remote learning environment, how we also look at trying to provide some of those in-person experiences as well. Because one of the things I'm hearing from a number of families going back to the spring, but even to this fall, is how remote learning is really difficult, and in some cases, providing services is either very difficult or sometimes impossible to do. And so we're actually starting to do appointment-based opportunities for students to be able to come in to also receive services from related service providers or other types of services. But it's this real importance. I was at the high school last Tuesday with our program for students on the autism spectrum, and many students who struggled the most with remote learning, at the same time also have the greatest needs for in-person learning, whether that's difficulty wearing masks or difficulty with a lot of the safety protocols. And so it's something that we're continuing to work really hard to sort of problem solve around as different challenges come up, looking for things like how we can leverage outdoor space and other strategies like that.
So you think we're doing about the same as other school districts are doing?
Well, I think it's chronic absenteeism overall, but I would say, in particular, looking at, some of the, it's certainly students with IEPs, but also noting, Latinx students as well are similarly at a higher percentage of trying to look at ways of trying to find out why that is and really doing that kind of analysis of what's the reason for that. I think there is a similar disproportionality at the state level. I don't know, specifically the numbers, but it's something that we've been looking at and trying to work with folks around understanding, what are the barriers and obstacles.
We have questions from 3 members about access to the internet and students having computers or connectivity to do remote learning. Suzanne, Joan, or Anne Cushman, do you want to fill out that question?
Well, I would just point out the obvious that, as you know, there's differential impacts vis-a-vis access to the internet, and the city itself is addressing through the city and city council the broader issue of broadband. And I'm wondering if you can assess that in some ways. And my second question was, is there a possibility of some of the teachers going to some of the larger residential places to bring things, ideas, interventions there? Are there union or insurance or other reasons that would preclude that?
Yeah, I would say probably it's not so. I would say the on the last question, it's more. What we try to do is to sort of be able to focus on issues related to ventilation and air quality in our school buildings. And we have, strong confidence in what we've been able to do there in terms of mitigating situations where we can, add HEPA air scrubbers and really monitor CO2 across all of our classrooms. It's the same reason why we're not using some other other community spaces. And really focusing on our buildings. So I would say that that's the primary reason, knowing that, we have confidence and assurance that those spaces are are well ventilated, whereas I think that's it's not just unknown. You know, not we can't conclude either way in terms of the spaces. I think one thing that we've heard also just from you know, as I talk with other communities around their different hybrid models is, you know, how just having some of that, I'm not sure if you were going here with this, your question, but having materials is also really important. So not just having everything on the screen. And so we have also been working, particularly for the younger grades, have different material kits. So like different manipulatives for math instruction, notebooks and other things that students can also have access to support learning that isn't necessarily always going to be on a screen as another piece. And in terms of broadband access, I mean, I think that, you know, we have been working to really address on a case-by-case basis whenever there are issues. I would say that, you know, when there are families with multiple children in the household, that sometimes that can be a challenge in terms of broadband and in terms of being able to, for, you know, simultaneous, you know, classrooms being run. And so, you know, trying to work with how to troubleshoot with that. And so our IT department's been trying to work with families as well as Comcast and some of those issues. But they're real issues. I mean, I think we're in a better shape than most other communities because of the devices that we've been able to purchase and to provide. But you know, you know, and we're not, you know, of course, like some rural areas where people have to, you know, have these Wi-Fi buses where people are actually going to, you know, the school parking lots in order to get access. But you know, trying to work around and again in some of the partnerships with Comcast around how to provide access to families.
Thank you.
Michelle, you had a question, Michelle Holmes.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Salim. That was an awesome presentation. I have a question about two things that you presented that are correlated. So I'm really happy to hear about the improvement in test scores and AP enrollment and things like that. And you also talked about the increasing level of socioeconomic privilege in Cambridge. So how much of that, are you able to tease that out? And show, I mean, how much of it is just because of the increasing level of privilege in Cambridge, or because we know that correlates with test scores and things, how much of it is because of the wonderful, you know, interventions that you're making in the Cambridge Public Schools? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we also look at growth as a measure as well, so that we're trying to compare students with students who have a similar past performance, academic performance, to see whether or not, you know, are they growing at the same rate? Are they having growth that's actually exceeding what their peers are experiencing across the state? So that it's not just looking at, you know, a cut score and how many are kind of above the bar and below the bar, but looking at growth as a measure. Yeah, I mean, the demographic shift, I think that, you know, there are lots of reasons for that, but I think as many of you, I'm sure, have observed over the years, just I think of a shrinking kind of middle class of families in Cambridge, and why, you know, as a community, I think trying to tackle sort of the real important issues around affordable housing. I think that we are also, you know, recognizing that it's not just, you know, socioeconomics that explain also the performance, right? And so, and that's why having a real explicit focus around racial equity, knowing that we also see that, you know, our African American and Latinx students are also underperforming, you know, regardless, if you look at the intersection of socioeconomic status as well. And so really doing that explicit work around bias, around relationships is important, and it's ongoing work. I mean, we haven't solved it, but it's really being, you know, through the outcomes and being really honest and transparent around where we're struggling to be able to tackle it.
Thank you so much. Paul Walker, you had a question about how this is impacting our budget.
Thanks, Kathy. My wife Debbie and I were both interested in how COVID-19 has really impacted the budget and whether, in fact, you've had any relief from federal, state, or local aid to try to deal with that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. We're actually presenting on that very issue tomorrow to the school committee. It is something where there has been, through the CARES Act, some resources that have been made available to the district and to the city. I'm actually just trying to pull up the numbers just to give you a sense of the scale. Specifically related to the finances, but we've spent about $7 million related to just sort of health and safety pieces. So personal protective equipment, the additional sinks, the HEPA filters, and engineering study, and the window repairs. The testing that we're doing twice a week, comes at a cost of about $25 per test. We've had additional expenses related to technology, and the biggest category is staffing. So we have over 100 one-year positions that we've hired for supporting this model. And so in terms of resources, there have been grant funds through the federal CARES Act. We've done some reallocation of our current budget as well, about $1.5 million of looking at what our current FY21 dollars are and how we can reallocate them to support the COVID response. But there's still, we're going to be engaging with the city manager and the city council in conversations around what the additional need is, as well as hopefully, Congress, I know that that's still in the works, hopefully, of trying to get some federal relief as well. Because we're fortunate in Cambridge to be able to make some of these financial decisions, but as many other communities have actually been facing situations where they have more often than not been looking at layoffs during a time when we probably need more staff more than ever.
Paula Paris, you had a question about the reopening plan.
Thank you, Kathy. And hello, Dr. Salim, Ken Salim. I'm a K-12 alum. I'm the parent of a 9-12 alum, and I'm the grandparent of a kindergartner, a remote kindergartner. So I see this through several lenses. My question is about it. I want to congratulate the city. I work with the Boston Public Schools. And so I see a definite contrast. This is a really well thought out and I think sensitive reopening plan, which I'm really pleased to see. But with all of the effort that's been put into it, smaller classes and all of those things that are beneficial and have great potential, is there enough capacity, building capacity in the city to accommodate full in-person learning when and if that should take place, especially given the context that you presented about enrollments increasing?
Dr. Salim has frozen.
Is he frozen?
He froze. He froze him, Paula.
I'm sorry.
An example of the issues with broadband in Cambridge.
Well, I think he'll come back. Also, when you do come back, Ken, I think you can hear us, but we can't hear you.
We probably can't hear him. Wow, he's really frozen and now disappeared.
Oh, I hope he comes back. But Andy Farrar has another question about stress on families and stress on our teachers, many of whom have school-age children who are at home.
You want me to go to the post?
Are you back? Or
I am back. Yeah, sorry. Talking of.
Can you respond to maybe Paula's question, and then I don't know if you heard Andy's question. Welcome
heard-
back.
Thank you. Thank you. I did hear Paula's question. So yeah, that question around capacity is a huge one. I think that right now we're using most of our capacity at elementary school. So it's the very reason why most districts have done this sort of cohort A, cohort B model, where students come in for a portion of the week, or they come in for 1 week and then they're at home the following week. So I think as we're looking at expanding, it's very likely we may have to look at more of those types of models where because that's one variable that could be considered. The other is adjusting the distancing. So right now we are having students distanced 6 feet apart in the classrooms. But of course, if you were to shorten that, which is something that actually some of our scientific advisors have suggested is possible, particularly for the youngest kids, that would allow for more space. But I think that, we're actually undergoing this now process of looking at what are possible models for thinking about our middle schoolers or high schoolers or 4th and 5th graders who right now are all, learning remotely. And I'm sorry, I didn't hear Andy's question. So.
Oh, Andy, would
I
you?
didn't ask it. Yes, Dr. Salim.
Oh, okay.
Excuse me. My comment is about the teachers and the stress that they're under, especially those teachers who themselves have school-age children. And across the country, we are seeing women leave the workforce in droves because of the stress of having kids at home, remote learning, et cetera. And I'm wondering, this is a multi-layered problem, but what kind of considerations might be there to support our young teachers with families, and whether that's also single parents as well who have families, and just trying to navigate this conflict between learning at home and having a career, whether that career is teaching or something else. But I'd like to focus on the teaching part of that first.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, and it is certainly a real challenge that many families and many educators are facing. So one of the things, because of the way in which we have sort of staffed our model, we've actually been able to accommodate the vast majority of educators that have requested a remote accommodation. Because we do have many students that are learning remotely. And so there are, of course, other provisions around access to leaves for childcare. And there are, schools that have figured out schedules so that, for example, for educators who may be in one of those communities where their own children are in school 2 days a week and home 3 days a week, where their schedule has been adjusted to be able to accommodate that. But we've been able to, for the vast majority of our staff who've needed to have a remote accommodation, request one because of either their own personal medical condition or because of living with somebody who might be at greater risk, to provide that accommodation. One thing that I think would be something that potentially could be something that would be helpful to some educators who are teaching in person is figuring out a way of having also, solving the childcare challenge. Mm-hmm. I think this has been a real struggle, sort of how to figure that out here in Cambridge, because, and it's sort of related to this question earlier around sort of different spaces, is, we have control over our schools and the sort of, the air quality and just the ways in which we can mitigate and have proper ventilation and the right number of air exchanges and all that. And it's harder, we can't say that for certain around some of the other spaces. And so when we have space available, we're trying to use it for in-person schooling. And so just that idea around sort of supervised remote learning spaces is one where it's a sort of, I guess, one of the key questions is if our buildings are, if we can bring in students, shouldn't we bring them in for school as opposed to just for, kind of supervised remote learning? And to be honest, it's probably going to end up being, as we're thinking about different models, somewhere in between, because we know that there are going to be some educators that can't come back for in-person learning. And so we'll likely be facing some situation where students are doing a combination of in-person and remote learning from school, and whatever what next phase of reopening schools might look like.
Thank you. There are several more questions, but I'm thinking it's almost dinner time. So why don't we just do a few more? Jim Roosevelt, I understand that you've been waving. Do you have a question?
Yes, I use the raise hand method, right? And so my question is actually a non-COVID question. And I'm wondering if you can tell us how successful you think the move to having upper schools instead of K-8 has been.
Yeah, while I wasn't here for the transition from K-8 to upper schools, certainly have heard a lot about that, all the pieces that were part of the innovation to make that transition. I will say that based on an enrollment measure, our upper schools are sort of bursting at the seams. Some of you who are familiar with the Tobin Vasselane project know that one of the parts of that proposal is actually having more seats for upper school students because we are kind of at the cap in a number of different areas, and so both in the last year at the Cambridge Upper School as well as Putnam Ave Upper School, and so we're seeing more students both sort of persist through the upper elementary grades into the upper schools. In terms of and also just in terms of the ways of having just those 4 schools plus the Amigos, there is more of an opportunity to have that teacher collaboration across schools in a way that I think is more difficult when you have 13 elementary programs across the district. And so I think there are definitely strengths. The work of our enhanced math program of looking at how we can have more heterogeneously grouped math classes across our schools has also been an asset as well, and kind of again leveraging sort of that model around the upper schools.
Very interesting. Thanks.
Bob Simha, you have an interesting idea to share. Oh, but you're on mute.
My question was, would it be helpful in your recruiting efforts if the city of Cambridge prioritized teachers for its affordable housing program?
Yeah, it's a great question. I actually think in a district I used to work with in San Francisco Unified, they were looking at similar type models, and similarly, kind of the same kind of challenge around the cost of living as being a barrier. I mean, I certainly think that would be an added carrot to living in Cambridge. I think that just because of the Boston metropolitan area, I think there are many people that do live outside of Cambridge and commute into the city for teaching, and there certainly is a value of living in the community in which you teach, and I think that would be something that could be definitely something that teachers would find very appealing.
Thank you.
Robert Winters, why don't you ask the last question, and then I just have a few quick announcements.
I guess basically the short version is just this, is that had there not been COVID, had we not had to go through sort of all this emergency type measures, are there any initiatives, things that we might have been doing that have had to been set aside in favor of this sort of emergency situation? In other words, had things not shaped up the way they have shaped up here, what would we be doing and what might we be doing in the future?
Yeah.
I mean, more as I teach mathematics, so that's kind of my general focus, but in general.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I think that that was sort of part of our experience even going through the budget process last spring, was I actually presented my budget to the school committee on March 12th, the day before, the last day before we closed, obviously then for not knowing that at that point for the rest of the school year. So in many ways, many of those efforts and initiatives are ones that have had to be pushed a little bit back on the back burner. That being said, probably the most significant investment that we proposed and that we're still launching, although albeit at a slower pace, is this Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. So we're actually in the hiring process of bringing on a Chief Equity Officer and looking at how we bring together family engagement, social emotional learning, and our equity work all together under the umbrella of this office. Because right now, that work has sort of lived, it hasn't had a real home. It hasn't sort of lived with academics. It hasn't necessarily lived with, special education. It's sort of been sort of out there. And yet, we've invested a lot in social workers at the school level. We've invested a lot we wanted to do work actually around restorative practices and supporting ways of alternative forms to kind of traditional discipline. So that work is still a priority, and in some ways has just sort of taken on a different we're looking at it through a different lens in this in this pandemic. But it has been, a slower ramp up to kind of getting there. And so, both recruitment and the hiring and all those pieces. So we're getting there, but it's albeit, at a slower pace. We have also just, I would guess I close by saying that, try to look at what are things we're actually learning from this challenging time as well. And, we adapted our summer program to it was still remote, but we had small groups of students working with teachers. And we actually used it, we did it in a way that coordinated across all of our schools in a way that was never done before. Before we had these sort of different programs. We had a Title I academic program. We had something called the Compass program that we did in partnership with Leslie. We had another program with MIT. We sort of collapsed all those together to really try to bring the best of all those worlds to be able to have a stronger, more coherent program to support literacy and mathematics instruction for our students over the summertime.
Dr. Salim, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. And thanks to all of you members for your amazing questions. Let's give Dr. Salim a round of applause. Thank you for your work and which has been made even more difficult with the pandemic. We heartily appreciate it. And
thank you, and appreciate the questions. And just, I think in the furious pace of the day-to-day, just appreciate the questions of just being able to take a step back, which is sometimes hard to do moment to moment, and just really appreciate perspective and your support, and just loved hearing just the different connections to the Cambridge Public Schools.
Well, we hope you'll return and actually have dinner on us another night. So as soon as we're having dinners, we'll be extending an invitation.
Sounds great. Thank you.
I wanted to tell you about our next programs. For members only, there will be another pop-up. I think Laura Roberts this was her great idea, and she's been organizing these. We had one in September where we were talking about, we had informal discussions in breakout rooms about the silver lining of COVID. We'll be having a more focused conversation on November 10th. That's a Tuesday night from 5:30 to 6:30. 3 of our Cambridge Club members will be talking with us about, it'll be sort of a debrief and a deconstruct of the election, the November 10th election, led by club members Jim Roosevelt, Pauline Cobb, and Paul Walker. So I think that will be fantastic. You'll be hearing more about that soon. And then our next program will be Tuesday, November 17th, focusing on parks, playgrounds, playing fields, and urban wilds, getting the open spaces we want. That will be led by Rob Johnson, who's the head of the Mass Land Trust Coalition. And we'll have many guests, including Melissa Peters, the Director of Community Planning, Bob Simha, longtime MIT planner, and then open space advocate Sarah Mae Berman. So we have a lot of really great programs coming up. You are invited to invite guests to all of our programs, so please do. So I'll be in touch by email. It's great to see all of you tonight. Thank you for coming. thank you for your excellent questions. And Dr. Salim, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Good night. Oh, and thank you, Ed. Fabulous web Zoom mastering. Yeah.